Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation tonight on an issue that is on the minds of many. I'm very happy to see that we have over 85 people joining us tonight and 20 students. I'm Lynn Randall, president of Chesapeake Forum, an Academy for Lifelong Learning here on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. In keeping with Chesapeake Forum's commitment to making lifelong learning intergenerational, we have asked Mekonnen Saleh Selassie to do the introduction for Dr. Yu tonight. Mekonnen is a very busy senior at Dunstan School in Centerville, where he serves as student body president. His current academic load includes AP Calculus, AP Government, AP Politics, AP Computer Science, and Honors Physics. He's also a member of Dunstan's Model United Nations Club, captain of the soccer, basketball, and lacrosse teams, a mentor at the BAM Community Center here in Easton, and was the finance chair and classroom instructor for the 2022 Talbot County STEM Camp for Underprivileged Children. Mekonnen not only speaks English and Ethiopian Amharic, but is also independently studying Arabic. I'm very, very happy to welcome Mekonnen to tonight's event and his role in introducing our 2023 Distinguished Visiting Scholar.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Shortly, you will have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Miles Yu, whose presentation will cover dominant topics regarding the United States' complex yet volatile relationship with China, and how this near-peer competition has great influence over the world we live in today. After Dr. Yu's broad overview, he will open this discussion to a Q&A session. Dr. Yu is a tenured professor of East Asia and military history at the United States Naval Academy and served as the chief China political advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He is regarded as one of the few senior U.S. government officials who spent significant time living inside communist China, resulting in his very personal familiarity with the Chinese Communist Party's ideological culture and overarching strategies. He's published widely on China and U.S.-China relations. Dr. Yu earned his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley, his master's degree from Swarthmore College, and bachelor's degree from Nankai University in China. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Chesapeake Forum's Visiting Scholar event with Dr. Miles Yu.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, President Randall. And I have a 16-year-old boy at home. He has his wild hair. We don't know what to do with it. Mekonnen, and you not only give me a very overly generous introduction, but also I think I found the inspiration for your very stylish hair as a model for my son. So I'm going to do that. I think, China is on everybody's mind these days. You cannot really live a day's life in the United States without some kind of China relevance. You listen, you turn on TV and it's about China. You go to Walmart and it's about China. So it's very relevant to us in our daily life. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to basically speak for about up to 30 minutes. I try to sort of not to talk long. And I will engage with you through a session of question and answers. I always find the Q&A is much more interesting than my talk. So I've watched some of the videos of myself talking. I normally don't learn anything from these talks, but I do really like to watch the comments section, and which are very illuminating. And so hopefully we'll have a meaningful discussion tonight. Now, what I'm going to start with is the U.S.-China relationship is very complicated and has a very long and deep history. It basically, touches on the fundamental psyches of the two countries, which are very different. Yet we do have a lot of in common as well. Excuse me. So let me just start with something we used to use this phrase up and down to describe a very turbulent relationship. This is also certainly true of the U.S.-China relationship. So what I will do is I'm going to see to sort of try to sort of elucidate a few continuities and changes and to see where we are now and what the future would look like. Now, when I say continuities, I'm going to say two and a half continuities, and I'll briefly explain to you what I mean by that half. So one of the bedrocks of the continuous sort of elements in the U.S.-China relationship is the fact that the United States always wants to treat China as a country of consequence. We always believe China is a big player in international affairs. Unlike the Brits, unlike the French, unlike many European countries, or even unlike Japan, the countries tend to put down China and it diminishes its importance. Throughout the history, the United States always try to make China as meaningful, as significant as possible. You can start with this open door policy, which is a policy announced by the United States Secretary of State John Hay during the height of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. And that the open door policy has a very important element. That is, we want to preserve China's territorial integrity. We don't want the European countries to carve up China like a melon. We also want to basically create a equal opportunity for commerce in China. So you can see, U.S. really is there from the beginning. And of course, in the 1920s, when there was various European countries and even Japan wants to carve out China, the United States hosted a very famous Washington Conference in Washington, obviously. We asked 9 major powers to sign a treaty called the 9-Power Treaty. That was meant to keep China a major country as well. And of course, there's World War II, and it was during World War II and immediately after World War II, and China became one of the big fives at the United Nations. This was basically almost entirely due to the efforts made by the United States, by President Roosevelt, and then of course President Truman. So and of course after the war was over, and we entered the era of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States' preoccupation was the Soviet Union. So China became secondary. It was not even communist to many people on the left. Therefore, we should give credit to President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who in late 1960s and early 1970s sort of began to change U.S. policy to treat China once again as the country of consequence. Nixon famously said, we cannot really isolate China that is radical and that is danger to world peace. The only way to make China less of the threat to world peace is to engage China. So we bring China into the international system once again. Now, of course, that kind of U.S. continuity toward China continues during the Trump administration. Trump administration continues to treat China as the major country, except this time as a major adversary. As a matter of fact, according to 2027 National Security Strategy, China no longer was a secondary country. It is the biggest threat to American security, to democracy, and to our way of life. So that's continuity number one. Continuity number two in the US-China relationship is the fact that China continues to be ruled by a Marxist, Leninist Communist Party with its core cardinal principles and the model of governance unchanged. Never any doubt about China being a dictatorship. So people might say, hey, there is an enlightened dictatorship. There is absolute dictatorship, but dictatorship nevertheless. So that one has never changed. I think, there have been some doubt as to whether China is the communist country or not. But that doubt was pretty much dashed, clear up in the last 5-6 years also with Xi Jinping at the helm. So he was a pretty diehard Marxist-Leninist leader. So I mentioned those are two continuity. I mentioned 2.5. The half one is something I call the Nixon Mao 1972 framework. 1972 framework referred to the kind of the framework established by Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong and the President Richard Nixon in 1972. That is that the United States and China will just seek common interest, but we sort of cast aside the differences, particularly on human rights, on trade, on economic engagement that as well. So we have to seek common interests. Common interests were basically defeat the Soviet Union and get the U.S. out of Vietnam, those sort of things. So those were 2.5, but that continued until about 6 or 7 years ago when the Trump administration came along. So it was continued for about 8 presidents. But then in 2016, that all changed. So it's kind of, I consider it as a half. That's why I say 2.5 continuity. Now, what are the major changes in the U.S.-China relationship? Well, the changes are profound. Number one, the world has changed. The world is dramatically different from the time of Richard Nixon, the 1970s. There are roughly 3 reasons for President Nixon to go to China in 1972 to establish this 1972 framework. Number one, it was the Vietnam quagmire. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president with the promise to American people that he would bring the U.S. out of Vietnam. But by 1971, and it looks like the war did not only did not stop, it actually was expanded. So Nixon was in a big trouble. So he thought, and correctly understood, the real reason behind the Vietnam War, behind the quagmire, was the Soviet Union and the Chinese support behind the North Vietnamese. So he would have to go to go to Beijing and Moscow to solve the problem, not basically prompt him to go make the trip. And of course, of all this effort was made for one purpose, that is 1972 re-election. Richard Nixon was obsessed with this 1972 re-election campaign, which obviously resulted in what we later would know as the Watergate scandal. And then, of course, the third reason was to form with China a coalition against the Soviet Union, which was the number one adversary of the United States during the Cold War. Now, that was 1970s. All the 3 factors, the Vietnam quagmire, 1972 re-election, and the Soviet Empire, they're all gone. Yet, the sort of expedient framework guiding U.S.-China relationship have been going on for nearly half a century. So that's one reason this change is so profound and very meaningful. Secondly, I would say since 1970s, the world has become much more democratic and more transparent. And thanks to information revolution starting in the early 1990s, you can see popular participation in democratic institutions, democratic processes were so much more advanced. It's highly unimaginable nowadays to have this kind of a Kissinger-Nixon style of secret diplomacy. In other words, you can make this strategic negotiation that matters, that basically matters tremendously to world peace behind the doors with the dictators and the key leaders of the world. And in the United States, for example, the Congress wants to get involved, and you got a C-SPAN, and the people are much more informed. And you look at countries like Taiwan and Japan. I mean, those countries have become very democratic. Speaking of Taiwan and Japan, democracy became a wave, became a fad in Asia, starting with the 1986, the Philippine Revolution, so-called People's Power, and the Philippines became a thorough democracy, overthrowing the dictatorship. Similar thing happened in Taiwan and South Korea and Indonesia. So all those countries in the 1970s were dictators, dictatorships. So now they'll be all being transformed. The Chinese Communist Party, People's Republic of China, was the odd man out. It was the remaining dictatorship sort of outcast right there. So this means a lot to the U.S.-China relationship because we began to look at something totally differently. For example, we can no longer just talk about Taiwan as a matter of who owns Taiwan or not. The Taiwan dialogue has been completely transformed in recent years from one of whether Taiwan is part of China to one of tyranny versus freedom and dictatorship versus democracy. So that's basically what we see right now. And then with the events that's going on in Ukraine, this point has been made even much more poignancy. So that's number 2 change. Number 3 change is that since Richard Nixon, the scope and substance of U.S.-China relationship has become much more multifaceted and complex, encompassing many aspects. At the time of Richard Nixon, 1972, U.S.-China relationship was a very single issue, either Taiwan, Vietnam, or Soviet Union. And normally one issue would dominate. And China wants us to focus on just one aspect, trade and economic, without engaging us on many other aspects of a complicated relationship, including human rights, regional security, intellectual property rights, industrial and military espionage, and even nowadays fentanyl, and Xinjiang, Tibet, regional security, and all the other issues under the Richard Nixon Mao 1972 framework could not be touched. So now those are the sort of impetuses for us to change the relationship. Now, so those are the sort of 2.5 continuities and 3 changes in U.S.-China relationship. Now let me spend the rest of my time talking about what has been done in the last 5 or 6 years. Now you noted that I said 5-6 years. I didn't say the 4 years between 2016 and 2020, because even though most of the revolutionary changes with regard to our China policy took place in the Trump administration, but the Biden administration, more or less, I would say 85-90% continue that policy, but they have the slightly different approach, but it's still a continuation of what we laid out in the Trump administration. And I think, first and the most important thing that happened in the last 5-6 years, that the United States had led the world to single-handedly change the global dialogue on China. And China has become the #1 national security threat to the United States. We made this very clear very early on in the Trump administration. And the reason we make that conclusion is based upon 3 things. China's strategic intent is not just to become dominant over trade. China wants to change the entire democratic and liberal international order led by the United States since the end of World War II. And China has openly said so. And they have, so they want to have global dominance by creating economic and trade technological dependency first. So intent, and also China has those capabilities. 40 years of economic engagement with the free market system, China has become much more enriched and enabled in power. China has become the world's 2nd largest economy. China has spent a lot more money on its asymmetrical modern platforms of modern warfare. In virtually every aspect of modern warfare, China has been ahead of us in many key critical areas, like artificial intelligence, like cyber, like space, and big data, electromagnetic pulse. So you can go on, the list goes on and on. China is much more capable. And then most importantly, unlike the Soviet Union, which was a primary adversary of the United States and the West during the Cold War, China was not isolated economically, financially. China was a full member of the international free trade system, benefiting from the international free market system. So when we talk about Soviet threat, it was several thousand miles away in Moscow, in Kiev, right? Those days. When we talk about China threat, it's right next door. It's right in your living room with a computer, So the China threat is much more existential. So that's #1, what happened in the last 5-6 years. Second thing that happened is this is one of the things that I was intimately involved, because I was working at the State Department with the Secretary Pompeo's office, in his office. I was the chief China policy guy. So we basically established a new principle. That is, we're going to engage China. You cannot ignore China. You have to engage it. We have to engage China on what China is, not what we want China to be. In other words, we added we have to base on our engagement with China on realism, not the romantic feeling about China could be and what China would like to be. Another thing we've changed is we could no longer ignore the fundamental differences between the two countries' ideological and the political differences. And that's why we began to see the Chinese Communist Party and how dominant our party ideology is, not only domestically, but also internationally. And the next thing that we changed is we began to engage China comprehensively, not to be pigeonholed into one or two single issues. If you're familiar with the U.S. Diplomacy in the last 50-some years with China, it's very, very frustrating, because if you book a 1 hour of talk between the President of the United States and the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in China, and the Chinese side, if you want, we always want to have something specific to talk about, either North Korea or fentanyl or Taiwan or European security. The Chinese government normally wants to focus on one. They drag it on and on. They will spend 45 minutes dominating the conversation. Most cases talk about Taiwan, but it's all empty talk. It's all about the principles, the red lines, this and that. And this no longer was possible during the Trump administration. We told them, hey, listen, if you keep doing this, we're not going to talk to you. So we ignored him for about 2.5 years. That actually worked. So we told China, you cannot really expect the United States to say nothing when you locked up 2 million Uyghurs in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, right? You cannot expect the United States to say nothing and do nothing once you completely sort of kill freedom and autonomy in Hong Kong, as you promised in 1984 and 1997. So we engaged China more comprehensively. In addition to the economic narrow focus, we also engaged China on virtually every major aspect of a normal relationship between two major countries. And then next one, I think we treat China with a multilateral approach. I think the current Biden administration accused the Trump administration of being unilateral. We're cowboys, we act alone. That's not entirely true. I mean, when we say China was the #1 threat to democracy, a lot of countries that had a very heavy economic and trade dependency on China would not go along with us. And they would not really take on our side, take side on with us. And for example, when Huawei wants to basically dominate Europeans and NATO countries' critical 5G telecommunication network, we told them this is not going to work. If you do so, we're going to cut off our intelligence sharing with you. We have to cajole them into our camp because we have totally different understanding about China. So for the first 3 years also during the Trump administration, there really wasn't much of the multilateral approach, but that's not because of our fault. It's because many of our allies, I would say most of our allies, were unilateralist. They accuse US of being unilateralist, but they are actually the one. But in the last year also, during and then immediately after COVID, I think most countries, most allies in Asia and in Europe have changed their mind. They moved toward us. So the Biden team actually inherited a very good beginning from us on multilateral approach to the China issue. So, but I'll say the last thing we changed actually, it's something actually. This is directly from the Donald Trump playbook. I don't know if I ask your students what is the most famous important book Donald Trump ever wrote. You probably will tell me it's an Harvard deal. Actually, it's not. It's a book that's obscure. Actually, he sold the fewest copies of. The title of the book is called "Think Big and Kick Ass." Very typical Donald Trump type of title. This was meant to be for Christmas, but obviously the reason it didn't sell well was because, parents probably would not, with small kids, would not buy a book with that title. But this book, Think Big and Kick Ass, actually very, very much captured the Trump philosophy, Trump doctrine, if there's any such thing. That is, you always think about the most fundamental issues. The first principle, yes, you should cajole NATO to pay off to 2% of the GDP on NATO defense, as they promised. But the ultimate question, the bigger issue, actually for the United States is why do we even need a NATO? Because NATO was created in 1949 for European security. Now, Russia is important. Still, Russia is making trouble in Europe, but Russia is such a small threat in comparison to China. So the United States strategic focus has already shifted from Europe to Asia Pacific, focus on China. Why would the United States spend 75% of NATO budget to focus on a security issue that's no longer the United States strategic focus? So we ask NATO questions like that. That's what it means by think big. And also, of course, when it comes to North Korean issue, we think big, and we basically stabilize Kim Jong-un and his madness. ISIS, we think big. You no longer negotiate with the bad guys endlessly. You just kill them, and that's why we were able to basically get rid of the ISIS problem that had been plagued the United States and regional security for many years. Kick-ass basically means that you carry out your policy, your conviction, with ruthlessness and with diligence. So those are the things that I think I would like to basically start my conversation with you tonight. I think my time actually is just about 30 minutes. So I will end there. Thank you.
So Dr. Yu, one of the students asked us something relative to what you were talking about with regard to Taiwan. Is it could U.S. ties to Taiwan trigger a conflict with China, and what would that look like?
So Taiwan issue has been there in the U.S.-China relationship from the beginning. China always say is the major issue. China would own Taiwan, and China's reason for wanting Taiwan is exactly the same reason Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine. It's not the international law. It's not the sovereignty. It's not nationhood. It's a civilizational belonging. Vladimir Putin wanted Ukraine because he denied the very existence of a Ukrainian nationhood. And he said, Ukrainians, half of them, they share cultural and linguistic heritage with Russia. Therefore, it should be part of the Slavic, Moscow-centered civilization. So the two major key civilizational states, which pose a mortal danger to global security and peace, are Russia and China. China has exactly the same reason. It wanted Taiwan because 95% of the Taiwanese are ethnic Chinese. They speak Chinese. So nevertheless, Taiwanese have already developed a very fundamentally different culture and nerve sense of nationhood. It has its own army, has its own foreign ministry. It has its own democratic election process. Taiwan has total freedom of the press. So it's a beacon of democracy. So that's why it's very different. Now comes to so what I would say is not that the United States' attitude toward Taiwan would provoke China to attack Taiwan. The responsibility of keep peace and stability along Taiwan Strait is strictly on China's side. So what has happened? Several things happened. Number one, since the Trump administration, we basically placed the issue of Taiwan. We developed a very robust U.S.-Taiwan relationship, almost entirely outside of the context of U.S.-China relationship. We developed a U.S.-Taiwan relationship for the sake of a U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So that's number one. Number two, we consult with our allies, Japan, India, and also South Korea in particular, about the Taiwan issue. And everybody agree with that Taiwan is China's Sudetenland. In other words, it's just the beginning of the chain of aggression. Just like the Nazis, Hitler would never stop at the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. He got Sudetenland through Munich betrayal, and he would go on to demand more, and then which ultimately lead to the outbreak of World War II. So if China takes Taiwan, next door Japan will be very, very nervous because it might well be Senkaku Island, which is disputed between China and Japan. And of course, after that, China has territorial disputes with virtually more than half of its neighbors. Right. Next one, China has fought the territory wars with Vietnam since the late 1970s, and China also has shared the largest territorial dispute with the second largest country in Asia and the largest democracy, India. And the clashes there were just very scary. The two nuclear power, India and China, the two largest countries in India, might get into a major confrontation. It's very real. So what we see here is that it's very important to stop China at the beginning, at the Sudetenland, at Taiwan. So that's our position. That's why we should give credit to all the presidents since Harry Truman, who have never give up making clear to the Chinese the strategic intention that the United States will always get involved militarily if China invades Taiwan. So there is a strategic clarity over there. You have probably heard about the strategic ambiguity all along. That's basically sheer nonsense. It's not strategic ambiguity. It's a tactical ambiguity. So operationally, we have to be vague to our adversaries. So back to the issue of the possibility of a war in Taiwan Strait. Let's just think about this. Two things, or three things actually. One is the Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping for the major battle and to secure his long-term dictatorship. So he has won that power struggle. And with that kind of a consolidation of the power base, he become much more confident strategically. So it's very likely he will basically to venture militarily against Taiwan. That's not good news. Secondly, there is this issue of COVID. So what COVID did to China is actually pretty devastating. Because of COVID policy, because China's response to the COVID, which is a total disaster, Xi Jinping has single-handedly destroyed Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is now in shambles. The unemployment among youths, I'm thinking about among people between age 18 and 35, is above 20%. Think about that. So that's why this is reality. This reality, however, might actually contravene Xi Jinping's strategic confidence, his likelihood to make trouble in the Taiwan Strait. Third factor is the factor of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine actually is very, very inspirational for people of Taiwan, but also it has served a pretty big deterrence to China. That means that a big country can be defeated. The chances of winning were not 100% on your side. And once you start, like Ukraine, once you start the war, and you will be isolated. And the United States has repeatedly told China clearly, without any ambiguity, that if you do invade Taiwan, we will sanction you. And the sanctioning China would have a much, much bigger impact on sanctioning like Russia, because Russia has already been isolated, sanctioned almost to the bare bone. And if we sanction China, China's economic ties to the world also create the risk for them too. So they know this is going to be very dangerous. So my guess is that China, even though on one hand, China might have more reason to wage a war against Taiwan, but they have many more reasons to think twice.
Question. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good. China's footprint in Africa has increased tremendously in the last couple of years. Examples including the military base recently built in Djibouti and the increased presence of Chinese nationals and African countries. How pivotal is China's grip on Africa to our national security? And how could the United States respond to their increased presence in the future?
Yeah, I think China's march into Africa is pretty comprehensive, right? So and China's strategic purpose is multifaceted. Number one, China obviously wants to exploit the raw materials, strategic minerals of Africa. So that's why a lot of China sent a lot of companies to Africa to extract gold and lithium and many other minerals to feed its industrial machines. So that's very obvious. So it's a race. We have been woefully inadequate in that regard. Secondly, China's march into Africa also serves to sort of isolate the United States precisely because of our negligence in Africa. Our presence, and China might want there to get more favor, to form its own Southern Alliance. And we have to understand China, as menacing as it is basically has no allies, literally. So they're trying to develop their allies in area that we neglected. Excuse me. But there's also a downside of the China's effort. That is, the way China developed its alliance and its relationship with Africa is very utilitarian and opportunistic, mostly through throwing a lot of money. And in many cases, it's a very non-transparent. They sign secret treaties, deals with, say, the government of Kenya, and the nation, the people in Kenya didn't know anything about it. And once this plot is revealed, and then you see corruption and bribery, and people normally, it creates a lot of instabilities in African countries. Some people just fed up with the Chinese and deals with their leaders. So that basically, China normally was to blame, has been the case over there. But what's more menacing to me is not just China's material gain in Africa. China actually is endeavoring to export its model of governance in Africa, according to the Chinese model and its own rules, which is also very dangerous. As you know, China wants to influence country. You normally one of the major reasons why China's economy has developed so fast is because it built upon a really bad model of a massive debt. It borrowed money they didn't have and print money to build stuff, and it constantly sort of building some shoddy projects. That's basically that happening in many countries in Africa. But worse yet, China is so cocky nowadays. It believes it has become a global power, a paragon of a superpower, for example. So it transplanted its own way of management and governance to Africa, which is pretty lousy and dangerous. I'll give you one example. China just finished last week something called Africa CDC. It's basically an African version of a disease and control center, like American CDC, but it's for entire Africa. This was in Ethiopia. But the entire safety standards is a Chinese standard. It's based on the Chinese standard from their own biological labs. And we all know the Chinese biological labs were very lax in terms of its regulation and its standard, which is one of the reasons why you have the lab leak, this virus. So this is very, very dangerous. The reason why China built this is because, China wants to co-opt the WHO, because the boss of WHO is from Ethiopia. So this is all very bad governance. So this has caused a lot of alarm. The United States actually is countering that. We started doing something, but I think Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, I believe, was there yesterday or the day before, That's because China sent his deputy premier to actually sent his foreign minister to visit 5 African countries. So we can no longer afford just being responsive to China's march to Africa. We have to be taking initiative to do more.
You know, the subject of Africa raises another subject that came up a lot with some of the questions that we got unsolicited as well. And that has to do with China's Belt and Roads initiatives, where they go into other countries, they help build infrastructure, and then, oops, you can't pay, we're taking it over, and now we own it. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, basically, Belt and Road Initiative is we call it the debt trap, but it's not that simple. It's you're exactly right. China saying we're going to finance this, but then we're gonna build it. China's workers will go to build it, and it's all basically because it's a debt. China didn't have the money, but they have manipulated currency, but they will loan the money to the host government, and the government would spend the money on the project, and after the projects were finished, and the host country will have to pay. If you cannot pay the incredibly high rate, and then you basically China will take your collateral normally, they own big piece of your sovereignty. That has happened to Sri Lanka, to Malaysia, and to many of some of the Pacific Island countries, and then definitely you can see the countries like Kenya and Ecuador, and they're realizing this is really dangerous. So they're they're thinking twice about taking Chinese money to build this Belt and Road Initiative. So, but in the long run, I don't think the Belt and Road Initiative will going to work, because it's not driven by market. It's all driven by ideas out of thin air. China spent a lot of money building some projects, and normally it has no economic viability whatsoever. One of the biggest examples is that China spent tens of billions of dollars building this deep water port in Pakistan called the Gwadar. The Gwadar was designed to attract something like 62 million tons of shipping each year. And it's finished a couple of years ago, and so far, fewer than something like 100,000 tons has gone there. So there's virtually nothing, because it's not built based on market analysis. It's built purely because of China's strategic intention, and decided by bureaucrats and party apparatchiks. So I think it's self-defeating.
Dr. Yu, another question.
Yeah, please.
In your opinion, is Xi more similar to the pragmatist Deng or the more power-oriented Mao?
They're all the same. Yeah. So it's not more or less. Xi Jinping does not have the sort of the sophistry and the skill of being a big dictator. I mean, he just knows one thing. That is, he just arrests all the people that have been killed or purged. But in terms of in your question, it sounds like Deng Xiaoping is more pragmatic. It's very different for me to accept that, because difficult for me to accept. Deng Xiaoping is a diehard Marxist-Leninist. He actually his entire life was the chief political commissar of the Chinese military. So he was the party secretary at one point, and he's very theory-driven. His so-called practicality is basically his tactics. I mean, he play. So the United States always take the great pride that we play China card. That's totally wrong, because China played the U.S. card much better than we play the China card. So Deng Xiaoping is that kind of person. He's very, very smart and manipulative, but also ruthless and reckless. I mean, this is the architect of Tiananmen massacre, for God's sake. So if you look at the Xi Jinping's enunciation of the major policies, either common prosperity or his policies about socialist and market economy, it all came from Deng and from Mao. There's no theoretical, ideological innovativeness out of Xi Jinping. So the only difference between Xi and Deng and Mao is that during Xi Jinping's time, in the last 10 years, China has become much, much more economically powerful, much, much more technologically capable. which allows Xi Jinping to build a very strong army and build a absolutely first-rate, efficient, dystopian surveillance state in China.
I had an earlier question in the chat that mirrors something that was said to us earlier, and that has to do with the dwindling birth rate and also the Chinese middle class destiny. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay, so dwindling birth rate, yes. Chinese government just announced a very important set of statistics yesterday. And they were talking about China's GDP growth in last year. China said it's 3%, which is all nonsense. Don't believe in that. I mean, last year the whole country was locked down. You have about something close to 1 million factories and business forced to close down. Unemployment was 20% during the most productive age group, and yet China still say it's 3% growth. I mean, that's just totally impossible. But there's no other way to assess that. So because China basically control all this access to survey economically. About the birth rate, yesterday the Chinese Statistics Bureau also announced that China's for the first time had a negative growth of its population, and it has a negative growth about I believe the 850,000 people birth. That number is just shy, make China's total population about 1.12 billion, something like that. And that's basically just above India. So because China has to be number one. But my friends who are very good researchers on Chinese demography and statistics told me that China's actual population right now is about 1.27 or 1.28. It's a lot smaller than what Chinese government said. The reason why birth rate was low is it has a very sad history, reality behind that. This is basically strictly because of the family planning, one-child policy that had been implemented for nearly 40 years until 2 years ago. So during these 40 years, one couple was allowed to have only one child. The degree of cruelty, the criminality against couples for having a second child and third child was absolutely just unspeakable. You can see a lot of human rights reports on that. So the reason, and China suddenly reversed that, all of a sudden reversed that 2 years ago. It says, okay, after 40 years, we are now allowing you to have more than one child, two children, 3 children even. Yet couples still refuse to follow through because they just don't want to have a second child. The reason is that 40 years of one-child policy has created such a catastrophic impact on Chinese families. That's because, say, if you were middle-aged, you were a one-child. First of all, almost everybody in China right now who are in the sort of a reproductive age, who are able to have children, are children of one families. So if you get married, say you were 35 years old, and you have one daughter, and that would mean you would have to take you and your wife would have to take care of 4 parents, your parents and your wife's parents, and who are very much dependent on you, healthcare and retirement, not all, because China's social security system is totally bankrupt. So the burden for the young couple, the middle class in particular, to take care of your own child, as well as four parents. In addition, the expectation of middle class is also enormous because you have pressure to buy a house, apartment, you have the pressure to buy a car. Otherwise, you'll be looked down upon. So the sort of keep up with Joneses, the pressure is enormous in Chinese society. So even if you lift up the ban on child planning, which allow you to encourage you to have more than one child, most couples don't want to do it. They think the pressure is already so onerous. They don't have the second child. So that's the reason why birth rate has become so low and so alarming to a lot of people.
Dr. Yu, a three-pronged question for you. What implications does our technological race with China hold in context to cybersecurity? Is this considered to be a particularly menacing threat to geopolitical stability? And how does this new form of attack influence China's potential expansion into foreign territories?
Oh, absolutely important. I mean, I'll give you one example. More than 10 years ago, China stole, through hacking, the entire US government federal employees security clearance system. That's over 1 million people. Everybody's security clearance data is there. I mean, I have government security clearance. I know how extensive those information sheets could be. So China had that. China basically had conducted cyber attacks on the United States through electronic espionage on virtually every single weapon platform that we have had. So you ask me, what's the implication? Obviously, the implication is that China can build much stronger, much more capable capabilities against us. But much more importantly is that when you know the bottom line of your adversary, China's strategic confidence increases dramatically because they know what you have in your hands. It's like you play poker. You know the what kind of hands your adversaries has. So that is why it's very important for us to heighten our cybersecurity and to be more creative to win the technological war. So I've been on several boards with some tech think tanks. So and this is one of the issues. Is not just technology. It's also policy. And our system, which is an open society, is awfully unprepared to face the China challenge because the Chinese government can have absolute access to control over its high-tech companies. Huawei, ByteDance, everything Chinese company can basically tell them whatever they want to do. And there's no resistance whatsoever. In the United States, we could not really order Google, Apple, Facebook to do anything. As a matter of fact, if we tell them not to do A, they will just keep proceeding to do A. We actually, during the Trump administration, we actually tried to ban TikTok and WeChat. And the President Trump issued an executive order to do that. And within 2 weeks, a court in California basically stopped us. So that's where we are. So we must have some kind of more comprehensive national policy to deal with the China threat, to reorient it, to change our economic, financial, military, technology, as well as defense and military intelligence structure.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. There's one other question, if I can pose it to you.
Sure.
If China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, in the sense of their economy, along with how the world reacted to Russia invading Ukraine, what would the timeline look like for China's economy?
If China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, the impact will be catastrophic. First of all, that will immediately get the U.S. involved.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, once U.S. gets involved, U.S. allies will get involved too, because U.S. allies, the U.S. basically involvement would have to start with somewhere in Japan, in the Philippines, or in South Korea. And if China, obviously, they want to knock out all the places to launch some kind of preemptive blitzkrieg, and that will bring all the countries into the fight. And the United States, keep in mind, also we have alliance globally, right? We have a commanding lead in imposing sanctions. There's all kinds of sanction regimes. So not only that, it will trigger not just the treaty allies of the United States to get into the fight. Non-treaty allies like Australia, like India, like Vietnam, they will have profound grievances against China. So they were very likely to join the fight. This will be very much like what happened after June 25th, 1950, when the communists invaded South Korea. So Korean War broke out, and immediately you have the international coalition, not through UN, but through basically the leadership of the United States. So that would happen. Now, if China attacked the United States territory in Guam or U.S. military in Okinawa, that's also very dangerous for them, because that would make China's domestic targets legitimate. So we can basically, once that gets started, and then all bets are off. And I don't think China can sustain a battlefields that on their own soil.
Coming back a little bit to the earlier question about cybersecurity, we had another question about how much risk are we in here in the U.S. from cyber attacks from China, considering our dependence on electronics for the power grid, news, banking, purchasing groceries, buying gas.
Yeah. The number one virtue of democracy is open society, is openness. The number one vulnerability also precisely is the same, it's openness, because it allows our adversaries to take advantage of that. They can, so they can do that easily. Cyber threats, cyber activities against the United States are coming from many directions, right? Let's just say the most serious ones, obviously, were sovereign threat, mostly from North Korea, Iran, and Russia, and China too. The difference is that North Korea is not, North Korea just want to steal money from the banks. You see a lot of bank fraud. Actually, it's because North Korea is totally poor and broke. So that really does not really touch the core of our system. Iran basically do a similar thing. They would do some kind of similar things, like to assassinate some people over there in the United States, and by following their whereabouts. Iranians right now have a sort of open rewards for the heads of a lot of American leaders, including my old boss Mike Pompeo, and the former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and all those people. So they have, it's a national policy. So we have to be careful about that. Russia's cyber attack on the United States mostly is through kind of loosely organized, semi-official rogues. They have been doing this, and also we have to keep in mind, Russia is a big bad boy, but Russia is really an original threat. Russia is striving for global relevance, while China is striving for global dominance. The difference is very, very important. China's economy is more than 10 times bigger than Russia's. Russia's economy is tiny, smaller than Italy's. So the degree to which Russia can do damage to the entire Western system is severely limited, is completely unproportionate to what China could have done. So I would say China is the only country among the four I mentioned, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, that has the much better organized, very sophisticated. They don't steal money from your banks. They don't steal. They don't try to kill some politicians. They grab your strategic assets, the most critical networks, and they penetrate into those things. You mentioned power grid, that's one, and our healthcare system, that's number two, and essentially it's a banking system and our critical telecommunications, our extremely high altitude satellites. That's a command control issue. Those are crown jewels of U.S. military fighting capabilities. And China, in certain ways, is actually ahead of us. So in those things. So this is actually very dangerous. That's why China poses the number one most severe menace to Americans' national security.
Dr. Yu, a question. Do you think Xi's comments at Davos is a real change or just tactics?
All tactics, because China right now realizes that it's really, the economy is is in bad shape, and it also faces enormous domestic resentment. China is very, very isolated, and Xi Jinping also has alienated almost the entire party apparatus. He's basically he's a lone dictator at the top. His situation is worse than Putin's, in Russia. So that's why he has to appear to be conciliatory, which is, I think, his great, because Xi is a very arrogant guy. So right now he has no choice. And I'll tell you why. Well, in Davos, Xi sent his vice premier there to deliver a message. First thing he said is it's impossible for China to go back to a planned economy. This is ridiculous. China has never left planned economy. Second thing he said, "Oh, we're going to endorse support the private entrepreneurs." This also is nonsense, because in the past, in Davos conference, you always have a half dozen Chinese entrepreneurs there to speak, and including Jack Ma, for example. He's been there several times. But this year, all those guys have been disappeared. This Chinese phrase has been disappeared, because there's not one single entrepreneur, a billionaire from China, and because they're all in trouble. The party is taking over.
We have another question that came in prior to our discussion tonight, and that was with regard to China having the most of the world's rare earth metals. Is that correct? And could China control making cell phones and batteries for electric cars? Don't we have those rare earth metals here too?
Yeah, it's if you say China has the world's most rare earth minerals, that statement is true, yet is not true. It's true because China right now control the supply. I think something like 97% supply of this rare earth. But China does not have monopoly of 97%. Their monopoly of this rare earth. Rare earth is a lot of places. The United States has a lot of rare earth. Canada has a lot of rare earth. Africa, Latin America, they all do. But to basically extract the rare earth from the earth, it's a very costly enterprise. It's also environmentally pretty bad. So most countries don't do that. China doesn't care about that, so they will care about this. Basically, have this stranglehold on the supply. So they extract a lot of them from their Inner Mongolia province, from some northern province and northwestern province. They do that. The world realizes. I think the country that really is acutely aware of this and taking action to counter this Chinese stronghold on rare earth is Japan. Several years ago, when Japan and China tension escalated, China basically said, "No, we're going to stop exporting rare earths." They weaponized the supply of rare earths against Japan. The rare earths that make all the chips, all these silicon circuit boards, and Japan was really sort of threatened. So what Japan has done is that Japan has invested a lot of money in areas outside of China to diversify the supply of the rare earths. One of the countries Japan has spent a lot of money actually is Vietnam. I believe they also spend a lot of money in Burma as well.
I have another question for you, Dr. Yu.
Go ahead.
Do you think it is more effective to support left-wing forces in China, such as underground communist organizations, to fight against the Chinese Communist Party than to support underground democratic parties? After all, the Chinese Communist Party still publicly claims to be a communist party, and using force against communist organizations would damage their public image.
Okay, so that's a very complicated question. I mean, you spoke about the left-wing forces. The left-wing, right-wing, conservative, liberal, it doesn't mean anything in the Chinese context, because all the anti-communist forces in China, they consider themselves as staunch liberals. If you think about the United States. Most of the staunch anti-communists were actually right-wing conservatives. So, so they're the exactly opposite. So I would not use labels like that to describe the forces. There are anti-communist forces all over the place, but they're not organized. They have this public awareness, this tremendous public awareness disenchantment against the party. But the party's repression was so thorough. China is a very high pressure society. The Chinese Communist Party each year spend more money on policing the nation, on suppressing the people, than the national defense budget, which is the second largest in the world. Think about that. That's why they could basically lock up 1 million people in Xinjiang literally overnight, because they could build all the camps very quickly, and they have a lot of cops. To implement the nationwide lockdown during the COVID, you have to really understand how many police, how many sort of armed forces people you would have to employ to implement that. And China is the world's largest country. So I would say yes, we will supply, but we cannot really sort of do the policy. I'm doing policy, guys. So I'm doing policy here. I don't want to advocate violent revolution or anything. But I do think if Chinese people want to say, if they want to have a free internet access to Google, to Twitter, to Facebook, and the U.S. government should encourage that, and it should basically factor those into our dealings with China. So in other words, right now, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, they're all denied access to China. This should never continue to be Google's problem, Facebook's problem. This should be America's problem.
Just got a note in from a missionary saying that his church has a number of missionaries in China, but they're worried about their safety. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I think the missionary is basically what normally has been primary target of the party, because they sometimes view religious circle groups with much more vigilance and hostility. That's because this is in a different battle, the battle of ideology, the battle of for the hearts and minds of the people, right? So Communist Party demands total and undivided loyalty from its people. So the reason why they locked up millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is not try to physically exterminate them, but try to sort of brainwash them to get rid of their faith in Islam, so they can. So that's why when they're in camp locked up, it's not just let them do nothing. They actually would have to go through a very stringent, systemic brainwash sessions, learning about Marxism, Leninism, and the wonderfulness of the Chinese Communist Party. Excuse me. I don't know how to answer your question, but you should worry about safety. On the other hand, the U.S. government has a much stronger position, and we have a much better system to protect American citizens doing religious practice in China. I think you can really contact the State Department. We have a very good Religious Freedom Bureau there, and so I worked quite a bit when I was at the State Department on this religious issue.
There was one other question that goes a little bit to what you were speaking of earlier, and that is, do you think Xi is learning from Putin's successes and failures in Ukraine, and how is the Chinese-Russian collaboration projected to develop? Do these two pose a greater threat together?
I would not spend so much time worrying about a Moscow-Beijing alliance. If they claim it's not an alliance, but obviously they act together on many issues, including issues in Ukraine and the United Nations and North Korea. All the issues that matter to global governance, they act together. On the other hand, if you can call that alliance, this is probably very similar to the alliance between Hitler and Stalin in 1939. It's an alliance of experience. It's an alliance of convenience, because they have those two are both ambitious persons. So there is a tremendous clash of ambitions. The clash of ambitions can manifest in many ways. Xi Jinping's initial impetus to start the Belt and Road Initiative was actually aimed at Russia primarily, because Belt, which means China wants to create economic dependency in countries in mostly the Belt in Central Asia, the Stans and the Middle East, just along the extensive southern border of Russia. That included Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all the Stans, and then Iran, and then you go to all the way to Turkey, and then you go to Western Europe, right? So Russia was never a fan of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then Xi Jinping, China has developed a very cozy relationship with Ukraine. So Ukraine is not really lily white when it comes to war and peace, because it had this ridiculous cozy relationship with China when it cannot really make up its mind whether to join EU or join Moscow. So obviously Zelensky is a totally different leader. So this is a hero of the world. I totally a fan of his. But before him, Ukraine has a very close relationship with China. China and Ukraine were strategic partnerships. The reason China is doing that is because China to try to take Ukraine away out of the Russian orbit into the Chinese orbit. Really interesting thing is in Davos this morning, last night, the first lady of Ukraine, Mrs. Zelensky, gave a letter to the Chinese vice premier, who was also at Davos, asking him to get involved in a settlement of the Russia's war in Ukraine. This is totally ludicrous. China is 100% on the side of Russia right now, abandoning its earlier strategic partner, Ukraine. So there should never be any hope about Chinese cooperation in the post-war Ukraine. China is going to be with Russia through and through. So if Xi Jinping learned any lesson out of that, and I think he did learn something, that the world is united. If you do something against Taiwan, your chances of winning may not be that really rock solid. Putin's quagmire in Ukraine should be a very big lesson to him. And I think the U.S. government has told Xi Jinping specifically about that.
Something else happened yesterday in Davos, where the WEF chairman Schwab declared that participants must double down on the transition to clean green energy production and the codification of social justice standards. Where does that leave China?
Well, China has continued to be the world's #1 polluter. There's no question about that. And so I know people are very critical, upset that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord is a joke, right? There's no implementing process. If you look at all the major countries in the world, the only country that had a reduction in emission was the United States, even though we pull out. China, India, they're not part of the deal. Russia as well. So you have to have a new system to have some kind of a implementation system to get Russia and China and India to play ball. So I think the green, you cannot just go there chanting slogans and demonstrating. You must have some kind of a specific system or organization that everybody has to agree to. China does not want to join that table. So, and pure and simple, nor does India. So that's a problem. So I would say, instead of taking something unilaterally by the United States and fundamentally harming our own infrastructure and economy, we have to do this globally. Now, John Kerry, President Biden's climate change green czar, had made a number of trips to China. China just kicked him like a football. he was treated like a jerk. He was cold shoulder. This kind of minivan you see probably in the street of Baltimore to pick him up from the airport, right? So he couldn't get the high level meetings with anybody in China. So this is why China doesn't care about this kind of agenda, even though it's highly popular internationally.
And the issue of social justice standards
Pardon me?
and the issue of social justice standards.
I mean, I don't know what you mean by social justice. Social justice is a concept mostly popular in the West. I mean, I understand there is the issue of equal treatment of all people, of all backgrounds, and that's fine. And I think the in the West we have come a long way, and I think we have achieved remarkable accomplishment, So yesterday was Martin Luther King Day. I mean, obviously we celebrated with great fanfare, and but China is not even a dialogue. If you say you want to advocate for social justice, right? If you say I'm a feminist, you go to jail in China. It's not only it's not a message. You don't have the right to be anybody other than what the party wants you to be, right? So if you say I want to promote, say, green energy in China, I want to start a company. You cannot last it for 2 days. Yeah. So that's the reason why this issue is not really germane. Now we can push China on the state level, right? We can say, hey, listen, set a standard. This is something that we want you to do. This is something we can do. But you have to have two to tango. I think this is the issue that's been long there on the agenda on the table. Back to the Clinton administration, we're talking about like some 20 years ago, right? During the Clinton administration, more than 20 years ago, U.S. spent a lot of money on something called the liquefied coal. This was particularly we spent a lot of money on China. We gave the Chinese a lot of money to jointly develop liquefaction of coal to purify the burning process, and didn't go anywhere. The money was totally wasted because China was not interested. They just take the money and run.
One question that came up that is germane at this point, I think, is that the question of how did China come to be the biggest maker of generic medicines, and how should Washington fix it so that medicines are made here in America?
China has the asymmetrical advantage, that is, it can outbid Western companies, pharmaceutical companies. So that's why they can do that. Another reason is that China basically can outbid the patents a lot. They have China is really interesting. The world's #1 holder of patents is Japan, so they hold a lot of patents. U.S. is way back. So generic drugs, China actually is catching up. So they do a lot of those things. There's also another issue here that is related to when I was investigating the origin of COVID for the U.S. government almost 3 years ago. Almost exactly 3 years ago, January 2020, I started doing this. This issue came up on my desk. That is, for many pharmaceutical companies, biologists and virologists, in order to make your research commercialized, you have to go through all kinds of regulatory hurdles, barriers. FDA is one of the last, right? So you have to do a lot of clinical trials, and those are very difficult to do and very costly. So many pharmaceutical companies in the West, you mentioned Germany, I mean, the Bayer company is a huge, giant painkiller makers. They had a monopoly on some, almost like a huge share of the Chinese market. And then they can sell it very cheaply. The reason is that they actually could conduct very unethically clinical trials on the Chinese patients on massive scale, collect the data, and come back to get regulatory approval from the Western government. So they have the patent, but they can produce and manufacture in China in cooperation with Chinese company and partners. That's why China was able to do a lot of generic drugs. And also, because of that, it has a severe consequences to the West. Our major generic drugs, a huge portion of them came from China. So we have this dependency on Chinese manufacturer. This is no good. Secondly, China could produce a lot of very harmful drugs and sold to the United States. One of the most pernicious examples was fentanyl. Fentanyl for a number of years was not even regulatorily monitored by the Chinese government. So you can sell to the United States very easily, just mail it. I was involved in this very fierce and very tough talk with the Chinese. We almost sort of, almost recalled ambassadors. That's how serious it was. And finally, we forced China to recategorize the fentanyl-laden filled drugs. And so China, most of the fentanyl drugs now do not directly come from China, but they come from Mexico. Guess who gives Mexican cartels the materials and technological know-hows and the financing? China. So that's why most of the fentanyl came from southern border has a Chinese origin. And to answer your question in a very sort of big detour, so I have to put this into context. Yes, it's very serious.
So as we close today, one question that came up in our emails prior to our discussion today was, what exactly is the newly formed China Select Committee in the House of Representatives? And what should Americans expect from this House group? And how would we expect Beijing to react to the formation of this group?
Yeah. So you probably mentioned about this House Select Committee headed by Mike Gallagher, who's a friend of mine. I know him pretty well. This is actually, it's not about a select committee. You have several committees already. Actually, there had already been a committee that's headed by the congressman from Texas, Congressman McCall. Congressman McCall's committee is called China Task Force. Was supposed to be bipartisan. So both parties agree. But the last minute, this is about 3 years ago, the Democrats pull out because they don't want to see that the Republicans was like taking the credit for this, which is kind of silly because this is not, China is not a partisan issue. All congressmen, regardless of which party affiliation they might be, they all voted the same way. All the China bills in the last several years, except the recent one about the committee itself, has been unanimous. So this time, the Gallagher committee, so I think their main mission right now is actually to regain the bipartisan participation. That's the real meaning of that. And I think, Minority Leader Jeffrey has agreed to send the Democrats to that committee. That's actually a very good sign. So I think the partisanship probably the very bad thing for our China policy. Now, before I leave, but I want to make a very, very important statement. That is, tonight you hear all this, doom and gloom message from me. I have to make a very important distinction between the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese people. The Chinese people, if there are people listening to what I'm saying right now, I can guarantee you, overwhelming majority of them would agree with me. So what I'm saying about all the threat, all the things, is not about the Chinese people. It's not about the nation. It's about the party that controls the dictatorship. So next time you see a Chinese guy in Walmart or in the Russian restaurant in the Eastern, just be nice to him.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been very educational. I think we've had about 75 of us spellbound listening to you, and we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us tonight. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Yu.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I really enjoy the questions. Were excellent.
Well, I hope that some of the students go back and talk to their instructors about their answers.
Okay, you know where to find me. Yeah.
Well, good evening, and thank you everybody for joining us in this program. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.